Hello, Professor Perez.
Hello there.
Took me a while to find the place. Can you tell us a little bit about your project, what you're working on here, and its origins?
Sure. So I'm working on a book project based on my dissertation research. Um, my research looked at families' experiences with public school choice, specifically the high school admissions process in New York City. The question that I asked was, what is the experiences of families applying to public school across race and class lines? I wanted to have a sense of how that experience was similar or different to people, what resources people used or needed, and because schools are so segregated, I used two different middle school sites. One that had large majority of white and Asian kids and middle class and upper middle class families. And 40 blocks from that school was a middle school that was very low income and almost black and Latino, mostly Puerto Rican kids and their families. And in order to answer that question, I engaged in a number of data collection methods. One thing that I did was I spent a day at each middle school for a whole year, for a whole academic year. So every Tuesday, I was at the school with the low-income Black and Latino kids, which I called El Barrio Academy. And every Wednesday, I was at the Gracie School, which was the school with the wealthier, whiter families. I also interviewed 80 people. Those included families. I later decided to interview school staff, and I can talk a little bit about why. And also administrators that were involved in organizing this process of high school admission. So I had interviews. I spent a day at each school, so that was my field observations, and I did a survey. I also looked at archival documents at each of the schools and of the high school admissions process itself.
So, how did you begin to organize your data to analyze your data?
Okay. So I've shared with you and with students that I've been very influenced by Jean Anion, who was my advisor and a really prominent scholar in looking at issues of social class and how that impacts people's access to education and opportunity. And Jean would say that we are always informed by theory. There are some scholars who say that when you look at your data, you look at it without even thinking about all the theories that you thought about in class. And Jean would argue that we always had data, that we always had theory within us. So one of the things that I did to help analyze the data is I would write a memo to myself every week while I was collecting the data that I also shared with Jean. So the joke was it wasn't a memo to myself, it was really a memo to Jean, but I would write it to myself in first person to help me begin analyzing the data. So in that memo, I would describe how either the interviews or what I was seeing at the schools connected to all these readings that I had done in my classes, specifically readings around social and cultural capital theories. So the work of French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and a group of British scholars who are inspired by his work. So that's one thing that I did. Another thing that I did, because of the vast types of data that I collected and because it was a full year study, I and Jean worried that I would be swimming in data. There is such a thing as having too much data and feeling at a loss at how am I going to organize it. So you notice I have these bins here in my office. So one of the things I did before we even talk about these bins is I engaged in pre-coding. So pre-coding is a way for you to sort through your data in a very quick and easy visual way. So, for example, I mentioned that I was in two different sites, El Barrio Academy and the Gracie School. So when I wrote notes on my field observations or jotted down some notes of the interviews, I used a blue notebook for El Barrio Academy and a pink notebook for Gracie School. And I stayed true to those colors. So just grabbing the right notebook, I knew those field notes were about, a particular school. So that helped me. The other thing that I did is because I was looking at this institutional process of applying to high school across a full year, the literature had looked at some of these processes and had already identified stages of applying to high school. So one of those stages is collecting information, another one is actual applying to schools, and another stage is intervening in the result that you get. So some parents wouldn't be happy with the school that their child was assigned to. So they would appeal the Board of Education, or they might have done some intervention before, like hiring a tutor to help them with their grades. So I knew that those were the general categories of this phenomenon. So these are where the bins come in. So you'll see here, I have data all over. So this is a bin for anybody that talks to me about collecting information about the high school admissions process, but it also has field notes about anything having to do with information, right? So it's all in this bin. So you'll see there's all these pieces of paper in here. The pieces of paper are transcribed interviews, field notes, and any handouts that the schools gave out themselves, right? So those are, public documents. This is anything having to do with applying to school, right? This is anything having to do with intervening. As you see, intervention is a big bin here. Anything having to do with how parents intervene in the process, right?
Would you mind perhaps picking a piece of data?
I'm happy to. Let me just describe the two other bins,
Yep.
just so you have a complete sense of all the bins. So these categories of bins emerged from the literature, but I found myself in doing this work that there were two other categories that I wanted to look at. So one of the things that you graduate students will find is not only does our work as researchers confirm or dispute work that's already out there, right? Theories that are already out there, but you can also extend the theory as well. So one of the things that I found is that it was very important to know what families' orientation to choosing schools was. So for example, many of the families in El Barrio Academy were always assigned to a school because of where they lived. They would say, oh, this is la escuela que me toca, right? This is a school that I'm assigned to, right? That pertains to me. So they didn't have a lot of experience in choosing schools, whereas the parents in the Gracie School were always choosing schools by way of choosing where to live, by trying to get in particular school districts, right? By strategizing that even before they even got pregnant with these children, right? So I call that formation, like how they formed into being. So here's all this information about how people understand this process, right? And then there's a bin that I call institution. And this bin is all about how the middle schools play a role in high school admissions. So these two bins are newer to the literature. This is my contribution as a scholar. And because I wanted to make it easy to remember, all the words end in TION, but your categories don't have to rhyme like mine. So Dr. De Jesus, you wanted to know an example of a piece of data.
Please call me Tony.
Oh, sure. Okay. So let me just pull out. Okay. So this is an interview participant who I will call Jody, who says, for Bard, that's a high school in New York City, you have to take a certain test specifically for that school. It was pretty easy, and then you get a call back for an interview. So the reason this is in the application section is because here's a participant describing the steps she had to go through, or her child had to go through, to apply to the school. There was a specific test and there was an interview, right? So test, interview, it goes in here. I'll give another example and then we can talk about coding. So another example is, right after we went to the school, we had to go to a specific interview. I didn't know the questions in advance, but there were specific questions just for me. So again, this person is talking about interviewing for a particular high school. In the information pile, a participant is saying, this is a student talking, I spoke to my friends. Many of us went to the same elementary school and we've stayed together throughout. So we all talked to each other about people we knew at the high schools. So here's a student talking to me about how he or she found that information about high schools. It was through these peer networks. Let me just give a formation one. Oh, that's a little complicated. Let me do an easier one. Okay, so this person said, I've been through this process before. My older son also applied to high school. We're going through this for the third time. So the reason this is in the formation pile is because this is a family that's clearly very experienced. This is their third time going through high school admissions, right? So that goes in here.
So those were all parts of different interviews that were transcribed.
80.
And then you rode
Yes.
through. You read through each of those line by line, and how did you identify the different categories and codes that then would lead to these larger bins?
Mm-hmm. So I talked earlier about pre-coding. So one of the things that was helpful was writing these memos to myself as I was collecting information. I would just kind of jot down in a little Word document or in my journal some themes that I saw happening, right? So the first thing that I did was, as I looked through the interviews, I said, where are people talking about anything having to do with collecting information for high schools, applying to high schools, intervening? And then there was all this whole pile that I didn't know what it was. It was all about how families learned about the process. I didn't know what to call it then. It wasn't until these pieces were coded that I then decided to call it formation. So what I would do is, and I don't think I have one, let me see if I have one handy. I had a full interview transcript. Let's see if I have a piece of one here. So okay, perfect. This is an interview transcript, right? This is a piece of one. And I spoke to someone called DG, right? And what I would do is all the transcripts have these numbers on the side. It's very important for you to have numbers on the side of somebody's interview transcript, because then you can tell that this particular quote came from page 3, lines 8 through 22, right? So you want these lines. You can get that on a Word template very easily, right? So this particular person is talking about a discriminating mechanism in high school admissions, how these choices are made. So I coded this discriminating mechanism. I put the name of the person, the pseudonym of the person, and the page. So I know this piece of data has something to do with discriminating, and I put it aside. Let me think how else.
Now, what are these other piles of data down here?
Right. So these piles of data are the same that are going in here. So what I do is I get on the floor, I sort them into these larger categories, and once they're in this bin and in these larger categories, they're then broken down into finer categories. So for example, for information, these are broken down into parent and student networks, right? So talking to people, the high school directory, which is a huge book where people find that information about high schools, websites, high school fairs, and open houses. So these are all the different ways that people found that information. So these are further subcoded into those categories. I did the large clumps first, and then I fine-tuned it into smaller. Some people do it reverse. Some people do the smaller and then find larger categories. So for application, there are different stages of applications. There are auditions, interviews, exams that people take. So those are the subcategories for application. And then the same with intervention. So these all have subcategories. So I did that for all of these interviews and I compiled them.